This is a lecture from Open Tuition. To benefit from the lecture, you should download the free lecture notes from opentuition.com.
As you can see, this lecture is on the chapter called Managing Information. It's not a very long chapter and there's no calculations involved, but it does stand to be quite important. That obviously, we've looked in earlier chapters about different decisions management stands to need to make and how we make different decisions. But managers need information on which to base the decisions. And these days, of course, because of computers, if things are set up properly, the computer can provide all the information they need. Obviously, it all needs designing properly. But what we're looking at here is various things. You'll see the costs and benefits of having an information system or information software, and ways in which it needs controlling and how we might go about controlling it. So first of all, you've got there costs and benefits of information systems, which all may seem fairly obvious, but installing a computer system and the computer software obviously is expensive, and we've got to balance off how much is it worth spending as against what benefits we're getting from it. And so I'm not going to write all the examples on the screen, you've got it in front of you, but the costs involved, you've got the costs of the hardware, the computers themselves, the cost of the software. That alright, some software you may be able to buy off the shelf, ready-made software, but for most, certainly larger companies, they'll have software specially written to provide exactly the information that they need, and that's expensive. Training, if you're introducing a new system or improving an existing system, then of course the staff need to be trained. That's, again, in a sense, a one-off cost, but as new staff join in the future, they all need training on how to use the system. Testing. If we're having software specially written, then it'll be a miracle if, first time round everything's perfect. It needs heavy testing to make sure it's doing exactly what we need. The maintenance and ongoing cost. We continually need to maintain not just the hardware to make sure it's still working, but the software. As our needs change over time, the software needs to be changed, needs to adapt. So it's always providing the information we need. Staff disruption and resistance. This particularly when you're introducing computers for the first time to a specific area. Staff tend to be frightened. They've always been doing this bit of the work, if you like, by hand. Tell them we're going to introduce computers. They're frightened that they're going to lose their jobs, the computer will take over. They're frightened that they won't be capable of doing it. Especially as staff get older, they're frightened that they won't be able to operate the computers properly, and again, maybe they'll lose their jobs. And that's a cost that needs managing. Clearly, you don't want to lose, you might want to lose some staff, but you don't want staff leaving just because they're frightened of what's happening. So there are all potential costs involved of introducing a computer system. But of course, that's got to be weighed against the benefits. Improved efficiency. We can get reports faster. It saves labour time. We can do things quicker. Cost reduction. That doesn't always apply, to be honest, but if we are able to do things faster, if we can lose some of the staff, then obviously, potentially, we can save costs. Customer satisfaction. If as a result of the new systems we can manage our customers better, a customer places an order, the faster we can respond and accept the order and deliver the goods, clearly the happier the customers will be, which may be hard to measure, but ultimately stands to benefit us. And better and faster decision making. That in order to make decisions we need information. If it's set up properly, computers can provide the information faster than if it's done by hand, and hopefully more accurately. And so, for both reasons, better, faster decision making. Now again, in the exam it won't be a question of costing these out, but do be clear that there's no point in doing anything unless the potential benefits are greater than the costs involved. Over the page, there's a bit of terminology which you may or may not already be happy with. But four bits of terminology, that are specifically mentioned in the syllabus. First of all, the internet. Well, since you're watching these lectures, you're obviously clear what we mean by the internet. As far as companies are concerned, companies clearly have internet pages that anybody's able to access. And they're using those pages partly to advertise. They give information about the company, just general information that the company's happy for anybody in the world to access. Maybe you're allowed to place orders over the internet, but again, anybody can access it. And so, of course, the information that's published on the internet by companies is information that they're happy for anybody to see. They're not going to put any, what you might call, secret information. As opposed to the next one, the intranet. The intranet is very much the same in that effectively you've web pages and so on, but it's limited to within the organisation. So it's as though a company has its own little private internet that only employees can look at. But there, they may give more private information. They don't want information available to the public. So it could be, one extreme, it could be trivial things like an employee is getting married and they're informing the staff. Obviously that's of no interest to the general public. Or it could be more business information, how certain departments are performing, how departments hit their targets and so on, which again may be important that our employees are aware of, but it's not something we want the general public to be aware of. So two similar things, but internet, anybody can look at it. Intranet, it's only our own staff who are able to see it. Wireless technology or Wi-Fi, again, I think you're probably all aware of it. But in the early days, if within a company, if one computer needed to talk to another computer, or if two computers in the business needed to share information, they used to have to be wired together. And in a lot of cases, they are still hardwired. They're actually wires connecting all the computers. More and more, though, and I'm sure you can realise perhaps more efficient, is to use Wi-Fi, where we don't need all that wiring around the company to connect them to each other. They connect wirelessly. Networks, well, effectively I've already mentioned. There stand to be lots of computers clearly within a business that need to share data. I'm sure if you're working wherever you work, it's not just you who needs to access data, so do your colleagues. And so We all need to be linked together or networked, whether it's by wires or whether it's Wi-Fi. But we do need to be linked, and if they are linked together, it's a network. Okay, well, that was just a bit of terminology. The next bit, though, is with regard to controls. And what we mean here is actually two completely separate issues. One is this: you've got employees entering data into the computers. You know, every time we sell goods, somebody's typing in who we sold it to, what we've sold, what the price is, and so on. And if we've got people typing in data, then obviously there's a danger they mistype, they make mistakes. Your job is to enter invoices that we sent out. We send an invoice for £1,200. Well, you all know, especially if you're under pressure, it's so easy to mistype and accidentally enter 2,100. Of course, if data is entered incorrectly, then ultimately the information, the reports we get, the accounts, everything is going to be wrong. So we need to do everything we can to try and make sure that people entering data, that they're not making mistakes, or that if they do make mistakes, it's discovered. And that's the first block of controls, which I'll say more about in a moment. The other side of it, though, we need control in that we don't want the wrong people being able to access data on our computers. There's lots of sensitive data. Well, we don't want, again, there's quite a lot to say shortly, but we don't want strangers coming into the company and accessing company data, partly because it's secret, and secondly, we don't want them changing things. So let's look at the two sets. First of all, the controls over the inputting of data. And as I say, what we're talking about here is trying to catch errors when people are entering the data in the first place, mistyping. And there are two broad headings here. What we call data verification and data validation. And data verification is trying to make sure that everything that's input is 100% accurate. That there are no mistakes at all. Again, it's 100% accurate. And that's very hard to achieve. There are lots of ways, as you'll see in a second when we talk about validation, of trying to make sure it's correct. But it's impossible to make sure it's perfect. With verification, we want to make sure every single thing entered, that there's never a mistake. And the only way really of achieving that is to enter everything twice. If it is so vital that there are no mistakes at all, have one person enter the data and then have another person enter the same data, and the computer checks the two and makes sure both people have entered exactly the same thing. And if ever that one person's made a mistake, but the second person has not made the mistake, the computer picks it up and we can check. Now, that's obviously expensive to have two people doing the same job, and it takes more time. But if it is so vital that there are no errors whatsoever, then that really is the only way of achieving it. Again, I hope that was clear, but I enter the data. I think I've done it right. But then somebody else enters the same data. We've got a pile of invoices, we're entering the amounts on them. Somebody else enters the same data. And as I said, the computer checks that the two sets of entries are the same. Now, as I've said, that is going to be rather expensive, both in terms of time, wages, whatever, which is why much more effort needs to be spent on what we call data validation. Checks that we build into the software. When the software is designed, we put as many checks as we can. And what this is doing is checking that the entries are what you might call reasonable, sensible, possible. What I'm getting there, just one example, you'll see there a list of them, but format checks for most of the data that's entered, we know what sort of entry it should be. For instance, a name. If you're entering somebody's name, it should be all letters. And if you mistype and hit a number, you're entering my name, John. If somebody mistypes and types JO2N, well, obviously that's wrong. And we can tell the computer in advance that whenever a name is entered, it has to be all letters. And if somebody does mistype and accidentally hit a number, it's immediately rejected. And they're told, error. I'm sure you've all seen that when you've filled in forms on the internet. Dates. I know different countries show dates in different ways, and that can be a problem as well. But in the UK, we tend to put dates in the form 20th August 2020. Well, if that's the standard form, then if somebody does enter it wrong, for instance, if they put 2013 2020, well, clearly there is no month 13. We can build into the software or get the people preparing it to put in that whenever a date's entered, well, it must be day, month, year. And we can restrict that, all right, the day, the maximum it could be is 31, the month, the maximum it could be is 12, and so on. I mean, I could go on forever, but postcodes. If we were entering details about our suppliers or about our customers, we enter their address. Most countries use a postcode system. Now, okay, the format is different in different countries, but in the UK, it tends to be 2 letters, then a number, 2 letters, and then another number. Well, if that's the standard format, then when the software is originally written, whenever a postcode needs entering, the computer knows it should be letter, letter, number, letter, letter, number. And if anybody tries to type it in differently, they make an error, it'll reject it. And a warning will come up saying, you've put the wrong postcode in. So there's a format. For a lot of data that's being entered, there is a standard format. Maybe it's all numbers, maybe it's all letters, maybe it's like that postcode. But when it's being designed, the software, every time anything needs entered, we should think, are there any limits on it? Is there a special format? Build it into the software so that it can check as the data's entered. It doesn't make sure it's 100% accurate, obviously, but it will catch a lot of errors You can still type the date wrong and put 20th of September instead as a mistake. So it won't make sure it's perfect, but it will help catch typing mistakes. What else there? Still on validation here, checking it's reasonable. Very similar to above, but length. An example here, maybe all our employees have employee numbers. I'm employee number 1832, you're employee number 2018 or something. Well, we can do a format check. If we've all got numbers, then you type in the number and the computer checks you're typing numbers and not letters. But if all employee numbers are 4 digits long, well, the computer checks you're entering 4 digits. If you only accidentally enter 3 or you try and enter 5, again, it rejects it. Another example, again, of validation. Lookup table. I'll use the same example. We've all got employee numbers. So when the wages department are typing in data, instead of having to type in my name in full, they just type in my number. They type in 1832. Well, of course, they could have mistyped. They could have put 1823, and that's somebody completely different. Well, built into the computer, we've already told it in advance everybody's number and their name. And so immediately you type 1832, the computer looks up and comes up with a display and says, that's John Moffat. And of course, the person typing in, they type 1832, they see John Moffat, they say, that's fine. If they've mistyped and it comes up with a different name, well, it's then obvious to them. Whereas just putting in a number, they don't know whether they've put in the right number or they haven't. Another one, consistency checks. Sorry, let me wind down the page. Consistency. I'll use employees again. Maybe when we're first entering new employees, we need to enter the date of birth. And I know this might not be particularly critical, but just to give you an example of what I mean. The date of birth, maybe somebody's born on 20th of August 1973. Now, maybe for some reason it is critical we get the date of birth correct. And of course, it could have been mistyped. Maybe it was 1983, not 73. And so, maybe have another requirement that they have to type in age. And of course, it depends what year we are now. So if we are now in 2020, let me think, if today is 2020, if they were born in 73, I think they are 47 years old. So, the computer screen wants date of birth, and later on, it wants to know the age. Now, of course, it doesn't actually need both, but it acts as a check, because the computer can be programmed to check that somebody born in 73 is 47 years old. And if it doesn't check, fine, there's been a mistake. It will flag up, there'll be a warning screen, and make them re-enter. So that's what we're getting at there. Have 2 bits of data, make them enter 2 bits of data that the computer can check one against the other. Again, doesn't mean there's never an error, But the more of these checks we have, the less likely there are mistakes. Nearly there. Next one, check digits. This is very, very common, but applies to entries that are all numbers. Back again to employee numbers. Sorry, I keep using the same example, but anything that's numbers. Suppose my employee number is 1834. Well, as I've already said, it's so easy for the person entering the data, and loads and loads of things to enter, they're going fast, to enter it wrongly. And of course, a common mistake, seen in paper, what is it? Paper FA, financial accounts paper. A common error is to transpose numbers, to put 1384 by mistake. I'm sure you've all done that. Well, to try and catch that sort of error, what's very common is when a number is allocated, when I'm given my employee number, that it may be 1834, but to get the computer to use a little formula to attach a fifth digit. Now, what the computer might do, this is very, very simple one. In practice, it has to be a lot more complicated. But it may take the first number and multiply by 1. Multiply the second number by 2, so that's 2 times 8 is 16. Next one by 3, 3 times 3 is 9. Next one by 4, 4 times 4 is 16. So the computer does this when the number's first allocated. It adds the numbers together. So what does that come to? 10, 26, 36, 42. And then it may add those two together and get a total of 6. Now I said, this is a very simple one. In practice, the arithmetic that the computer's doing is a lot more complicated, but it follows a standard set of rules. But if this was the rule, I've ended up with 6. And so they put that at the end, and that becomes my number. And from then on, whenever they enter my number, they enter 18346, and immediately they enter it, the computer repeats the arithmetic and checks it works. So, for instance, if I enter by mistake 13846, it multiplies the first one by 1, the second one by 2, the third one by 3, the fourth one by 4. It adds them together and gets 47, I think. It adds them together and gets 11, and because there are 2, it would add them together and get 2. And it says, the last number should be 2, but it's 6, so the number can't be right. It must have been entered wrongly, because 6 doesn't work with the other numbers. And that last digit is called a check digit. The computer's using it to check the numbers being entered correctly. Now, see, that's very, very common. Whether you're aware of it or not, most numbers that are entered, the last number is a check digit. VAT numbers, sales tax, companies have their own number. Well, there are check digits involved, and so it's immediately spotted if the number's been entered wrongly. Bank account numbers, same thing. Now again, that isn't 100% guaranteed to be accurate. I'm sure you could play with the numbers and still find a way of entering it wrong, and the last number being 6. But especially given that what you might call the formula they use tends to be a lot more complicated. It's a very, very good check. It almost guarantees it's accurate. Yeah, it's very unlikely that you'd accidentally type a wrong number where the formula worked. All right, all those things I mentioned relate to validation. However, that really becomes critical when people are typing data in. And of course, even now, most data is typed in by hand, and that's when we make mistakes. Wherever possible, though, the best way of avoiding that happening is what we call direct data capture. Where data is entered automatically, it doesn't rely on somebody typing it in. And the most obvious example, which you've all seen, is barcodes. Now, I'm sure wherever you are, you've seen what barcodes are. When you buy something in the shop, it's got this thing on it which are thin and thick lines. I'm not drawing it very well, but oh dear, I shouldn't have done that, but I think you know what I mean. And of course, shops, supermarkets in particular, use it. But in the old days, they would have to type in the price by hand into the cash machine. And they make mistakes. Something costs €5.20 and they accidentally type €6.20. Well, with barcodes, it's scanned. And I'd be wrong to say there can never be fault with the machines, but it's almost certain that it'll be scanning the right item, and therefore it'll get the right price. So, of course, supermarkets use, well, all shops tend to use barcodes these days. All products are printed with them. But even within a company, if the company's making something and they need to track what they're selling around the factory, put a barcode on it, and they can use a scanner, and they can check without somebody having to keep typing in by hand. All right, nearly there, but they were all ways of checking that what we enter is correct. But I did say at the beginning, another aspect in which we need to keep control is that we're not letting the wrong people access our data. Clearly, we don't want people seeing data they shouldn't be seeing. We don't want people stealing data. We don't want the wrong people changing data. And so you've got a list of controls there. The first is what we call physical access. Which people forget is almost too obvious. Most offices are full of computers. And if somebody gets into the office and manages to steal one of the computers, then whatever other safeguards we might have, almost certainly they will be able to get into the computer and start accessing our data. And so clearly we need to restrict access to the office. Don't let anybody walk in and sit down at one of our computers. What we call physical access. Have guards on the door. Or have these chips that the only way you can get into the office is by holding a chip against the door which releases the lock. So, it's the most obvious thing of all, restrict access to the computers. The next one, of course, is passwords. That make sure that the only way to get into the computer and therefore access data is to enter a password. Now that may seem obvious, and again, I'm sure you all are using some sort of computer, obviously, to watch this, and I'm sure you know all about what we mean by a password. But there's quite a lot involved here, and I won't go on too long, but we could go on forever almost. Because not only make sure you have a password to enter the computer, but we need to think when we're designing a system, does your password only let you into your computer? Or are you in a job where you may be using different computers? You know, we share the computers. There's 10 in this office and you might be using any of them. Will your password only work on one computer, or would it work on several? Maybe it only needs to work on one. Maybe it needs to work on several. We need to think about it. Another thing is, given computers are networked these days, and so all computers are linked to each other and they can all access the same data, we need to make sure that the right people can look at the right data. What I mean is this. There'll be information, there'll be data in human resources about employee details, all their, if you like, personal details and what their rate of pay is. You've also got people in the accounts department who need to know what total wages are, but we don't want them to be able to look at somebody's personal details. So human resources can look up your details. Accounts department can't look up your details. But the computers are all linked together. And so we must make sure that those people in the accounts department, their password lets them look at accounts information, but doesn't let them see human resources information. And equally, people in human resources, their password lets them see employee information, but doesn't let them see other accounting information. We call this hierarchical passwords. That your password doesn't only let you into the computer, but also the password determines what you're allowed to look at. Sorry, my writing's awful. And it's something that needs thinking about a lot when the systems are being designed. You know, the person in overall charge, Chief Executive Officer, their password perhaps lets them look at anything on the database. But the more junior you are, the more limited it is as to what you can see and what you can do. You know, does my password simply let me enter data, or does it let me change data? Depends on my level of seniority. Well, the password lets the computer know who you are and how senior you are. Next, going down the list. Oh dear, where am I? Here we are. Firewalls. These become quite critical when the computers are connected to the internet. You know, we've got all the computers in the office. They're all connected to each other. But if there's an external connection, if they're allowed to connect to the internet, then if we can connect outside, people outside can connect inside to us. Now, okay, they may need passwords and so on. But there are very clever ways people go about trying to break passwords. And so a firewall is blocking people from outside coming in via the wires. You know, we're wired to get out to the internet. People can look at our internet pages, but there's a an electronic block which stops them actually getting into our system. That's a firewall. Antivirus software. Slightly different, but again, I'm sure you all know what I mean by antivirus. That if anybody does get into our system in any way, or one of our employees looks at an email and there's a virus on it, it's a little program that can start infecting our system and could start destroying, changing, stealing data. And so it's vital we have antivirus software which can spot anything trying to insert these little programs into our systems. And finally, encryption. Encryption is where things are in code. And so, whatever steps we take to prevent people breaking into our system, nothing's perfect. You've heard of hacking. People find ways of getting in. Well, with encryption, even if somebody manages to get into our system and steals our data, if it's all kept in code, then hopefully they won't be able to make any sense of it. It's all coded up. The computer automatically codes it, and when we use the data, it automatically unencodes it, decodes it. But somebody else steals it. Hopefully, they won't be able to understand it because it's in code. Okay, there we go. Managing information.